My self-centered wife vanished after what she said was a girl's trip, and years later, she reappeared at my door with a baby, so I made sure her life unraveled. You know how people always say, "I never saw it coming"? That's exactly how it felt for me. My wife and I had been together for a solid 4 years, married all of them, and I truly thought we had something good going. We had plans, a whole life mapped out, and I genuinely believed we were on the same page. The thing is, we both wanted kids, or at least I thought we both did. Right after we got married, we started talking about it seriously. She'd always say how she wanted 2 or 3 kids, constantly talking about names, how we'd decorate the nursery, everything down to the smallest details. She'd even spend time online looking at baby clothes and gadgets, picturing this life with our future kids. It was something we bonded over, a dream that kept us close. We were both excited and ready to dive into this next chapter, feeling like everything was falling into place. But then we were blindsided by some terrible news. After months of trying to have kids, we went to the doctor to see if something was wrong. Long story short, the issue was with me. My fertility count was way too low, and the doctor basically told us that our chances of having kids naturally were slim to none. Hearing that felt like a punch to the gut. I felt utterly useless. All those plans we'd made just disappeared in an instant. The news hit me hard, really hard. I spiraled into a dark place for a while, and although therapy eventually helped, I was a complete mess in the beginning. She seemed pretty supportive initially, saying it didn't matter and that she'd be happy with just the 2 of us. But right from the start, something felt off about the way she said it. She dropped the topic far too quickly. One day she was all about having a family, and the next she claimed she didn't need kids to be happy. And don't get me wrong, I understand that people change their minds, but her whole attitude was just weird. She'd gone from daydreaming about baby names to totally dodging any mention of kids. And not only that, but it was like she started seeing me differently too. Out of nowhere, she'd make these small, hurtful comments, things she'd never said before. Remarks about how I wasn't taking care of myself, how I should get in shape, or be more productive around the house. And, yeah, maybe I had put on a bit of weight, but it felt like she was finding reasons to be disappointed in me. When I asked her about the sudden change in attitude, she'd brush it off, saying I was imagining things and being overly sensitive. But I knew something was up. The woman I married, who used to spend hours talking with me about our future, felt like a different person. She wasn't exactly mean, but there was a new coldness to her, like she'd already checked out mentally and was just going through the motions. Over time, I started to believe her words when she said everything was fine, and I stopped pushing back, not wanting to come across as insecure or needy. Anyway, fast forward a few years, and we were just coasting day by day. We'd fallen into this routine where we barely talked about anything meaningful. It felt like we were roommates more than a married couple. I tried bringing up other options, adoption, surrogacy, but every time, she'd shut them down, saying she didn't want to consider it. She'd tell me, "I'm happy as long as we're together," but it felt like she was convincing herself more than me. Then, out of the blue, she told me she wanted to go on a girls' trip. It wasn't unusual for her to go on trips with her friends. She'd done it before, and I always supported her. We lived in Brighton, and she'd mentioned wanting to visit America with her friends for a while, so I didn't think twice about it. We'd built up this trust over the years, so I even helped her pack, made sure she had everything she needed, and drove her to the airport. I remember the last thing she said before she left. She turned to me and said, "Thank you for being so supportive." It struck me as a little strange because I didn't feel like I'd done anything special, but she seemed genuinely appreciative, so I brushed it off. That night, I stayed up to call her after she landed, just to make sure everything had gone smoothly. Her flight was supposed to take around 9 hours, so I kept myself busy around the house, watching TV, checking the clock, and waiting for her text to say she'd landed. When her flight touched down, I called to check in, but the phone just rang and rang without an answer. I figured she was tired and maybe went straight to her hotel to sleep, so I didn't worry about it. But by the time morning rolled around, I still hadn't heard from her. A gnawing worry settled in the pit of my stomach. I tried calling again and sent a few texts, thinking maybe she was busy or her phone was on silent. But after a few more hours of silence, I was officially freaking out. I called her sister to see if she'd heard anything, but she hadn't. By now, I was in a full-blown panic. I even called the friends she was supposed to be with, thinking maybe something had happened to her phone or she hadn't had a chance to check in. But they were as confused as I was. They weren't on any trip with her. They were 2 blocks away, sitting at a coffee shop. That's when it all hit me. She wasn't on a girls' trip. She wasn't with her friends. She hadn't gone anywhere. She was just gone. I sat there holding the phone, feeling like my stomach had dropped straight through the floor. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. This wasn't the woman I'd married. It felt like she was someone I didn't even know. The pieces began falling into place: the coldness, her avoidance of our future plans, the little digs about my appearance and health. She'd been withdrawing for a while, and I just hadn't noticed, or maybe I didn't want to see it. That night, I sat staring at my phone, hoping for a message, a call, anything. But I knew, deep down, that nothing would come. The next morning, I woke up and stared at the ceiling, still half expecting it was some twisted dream. But her side of the bed was empty, and reality hit hard. She'd really left, packed up, and disappeared. All those excuses I'd made up the night before: maybe she was delayed, maybe her phone had died, they didn't hold anymore. It was clear she'd planned to leave and wanted out. Those first few days, I was in denial. I kept calling her, hoping to hear her voice, trying to find some explanation. I left countless messages, often with no idea what to say, but hoping she'd respond. But all I got was silence, which made it even worse. I felt abandoned, left to solve this mystery on my own. Initially, her family was just as shocked as I was. Her mom didn't know anything about her plans, and they hadn't heard from her either. I found myself at their house more times than I could count, talking to her mom and hoping for answers. I think they felt bad for me. Her mom even let me stay over some nights and made meals when I couldn't bring myself to cook. She'd sit and listen while I went on about the small details that didn't make sense, trying to piece together how my life had unraveled without warning. Some nights I just sat there, too numb to say anything. I swung between anger, sadness, and guilt. I kept wondering what I'd done wrong, if I'd missed signs, if I hadn't given her enough attention. I went over every conversation, every argument, trying to figure out what had driven her to leave. I became obsessed with finding an answer, like that might somehow fix it. I hardly ate, barely slept, and my work started to suffer. People noticed and would ask if I was okay, but I'd just shrug it off, saying I was dealing with personal issues. It felt humiliating to explain the truth, to say out loud that my wife had left without a word. Eventually, I confided in a couple of close friends, and they tried to help, taking me out and encouraging me to move on. But even then, my mind would drift back to her, wondering where she was and why I hadn't been enough to make her stay. One of the worst parts was the constant questions from people who didn't know: neighbors, family, friends, even old colleagues who'd heard I was married would ask, "How's married life?" or "How's your wife?" Each time, it felt like ripping open a fresh wound. I didn't have the heart to admit she'd left, so I'd just smile and say everything was fine, though that lie grew heavier every time I told it. Therapy ended up being the only thing that really helped. I'd never tried it before, but after months of barely functioning, I knew I couldn't handle it alone. So I found a therapist and started going weekly, talking to someone who didn't know me, her, or any of our baggage. It was freeing. I vented about the anger, the betrayal, the empty space she'd left in my life. I talked about the sleepless nights, how I'd lie awake replaying everything over and over. My therapist helped me see that there was no magic moment that would have kept her here, that her decision to leave was her own. It took time to accept, but eventually I stopped blaming myself. I'd spent so long thinking something was wrong with me that I'd somehow pushed her away. But gradually, I started to see things differently. She'd been distant and cold for a while, and I'd ignored it, hoping things would improve on their own. I'd convinced myself that I could keep everything together, that my effort alone would keep our marriage alive, but it wasn't enough. As time passed, I took small steps to rebuild my life. I hadn't realized how much of myself I'd lost in our marriage until she was gone. I'd always been the one to make the effort, to make her happy, and to keep our home life comfortable. Now, with so much free time, I had no idea what to do with it. So I started picking up old hobbies, things I'd forgotten about. I hit the gym, began reading books I'd put off, even tried cooking new recipes. Work slowly got better too. At first, I was just going through the motions, barely keeping up, but as I felt more like myself, I threw myself into my job. It was one of the few areas where I felt capable and in control. I'd always been good at my work, but now I doubled down, putting in extra hours and effort. It paid off in the form of a promotion, something that never would have happened if I'd been lost in self-pity. Still, some days hurt. Every so often, I'd come across something that reminded me of her, a photo, an old movie ticket, little mementos that brought back memories I was trying to forget. I'd look at them and wonder where she was, if she ever thought about me, if she regretted what she did. But gradually, those moments became less painful. Each time, I was able to pack away those memories a little faster, move forward a little easier. I also reconnected with friends I hadn't seen much since getting married. We started doing things again, hitting the golf range, going on hikes, activities I hadn't done in years. It felt good to have people in my corner who weren't part of the mess, who could help me move on without dragging me back into the pain. Reflecting on it all, I could see just how much of myself I'd invested in that relationship, in being her husband. When she left, it felt like she took a piece of me with her, like I'd lost a major part of who I was. But gradually, I started finding myself again, piece by piece. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't quick, but I was making progress. By the end of that year, I could look in the mirror and see someone who wasn't defined by her actions. I was more than just the guy whose wife disappeared. I'd survived, rebuilt, and emerged stronger. For the first time in ages, I felt like I could truly live without her shadow hanging over me, and I was honestly proud of that. I thought I'd put it all behind me, that life was finally feeling normal again, or as close to normal as it could get after all that chaos. My routine was set, my friends kept me busy, and work was going well. I'd even stopped thinking about her daily. Of course, memories would creep up every now and then, but it wasn't like before when every moment somehow led back to her. So, when I heard a knock on my door one Saturday morning, she was the last person I expected to see standing there. But there she was, right on my doorstep, holding a baby. I froze, my mind just went blank for a second, as though I was staring at a ghost. She looked almost the same, maybe a bit worn out, but still her. She gave me a look that somehow conveyed she thought I'd be glad to see her. And yeah, that stung because I really believed I was done feeling anything for her. Turns out, seeing her stirred up a lot I thought I'd buried. I didn't say a word at first, just stood there staring. She smiled, as if nothing had happened, and then, without a trace of shame, asked, "Can I come in?" The nerve of it. After everything she'd put me through, she just shows up like I'm supposed to welcome her with open arms. But I kept calm and told her, "No, you can stay right there and explain." I didn't want her stepping into my space, bringing all that chaos back into the home I'd worked hard to rebuild. She seemed a little thrown off, but stayed put and launched into her story. She started with, "I know this might be a shock," but I wanted to come back and explain everything. She even looked hopeful, like she genuinely thought I'd be interested in listening. I was torn between laughing in her face and just slamming the door, but curiosity kept me listening. I wanted to hear her excuse, to understand how she'd rationalized vanishing from my life. She continued, talking about how she'd made a huge mistake leaving, how she realized she'd lost the best thing that ever happened to her, her words, not mine. She claimed she'd spent a lot of time reflecting, and that after having this baby, she finally understood what was important in life. Apparently what mattered most was to show up unannounced at my door after ghosting me for years. And then, looking down at the baby, she said, "This is our second chance." I couldn't believe my ears. A second chance? Like this baby was a magic reset button, and we'd just continue from where we'd left off. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but inside I was livid. She kept going, saying she wanted us to be a family again, that she'd made a huge mistake, but now we could start fresh, just the three of us. Finally, I couldn't hold back anymore and asked the one question that had haunted me since she showed up: "Why did you leave?" I did my best to keep my tone steady, but I wasn't sure how long I could hold it together. After years of tormenting myself with guesses, I needed to hear it from her. She hesitated, looking down as though ashamed, but finally admitted what I assumed was the truth. She said she'd left because she wanted a child, and since I couldn't give her one, she found someone who could. She said it like it was no big deal, as if she hadn't completely destroyed my life, as if I should just nod and accept it. She explained that the guy she'd left with didn't stick around, but by then she'd had the baby and realized she wanted me back. Simple as that. I took a moment to process what she was saying. Here she was, openly confessing she'd abandoned me, run off with some guy, had his baby, and now thought I should be fine with it. I looked at her and said, "So, you left, found someone else, had his baby, and now you think you can come back and pretend like nothing happened?" She broke down crying, repeating how sorry she was, saying she'd made a huge mistake. She insisted I was the one she truly loved, that we were meant to be together. Honestly, it was hard not to laugh. She sounded so out of touch, as though this was a romance story with a happy ending in sight. Then she tried guilt-tripping me, going on about how hard it was to be a single mom, how tough her life had been. She even tried painting herself as the victim, as though her choices hadn't led her exactly to this point. She said she needed my support, that she was finally ready to make things work between us. The whole time I just kept thinking, who does she think I am? I let her talk, but at that point, I was done listening. I told her flatly, you made your choice a long time ago. Now you have to live with it. There's no second chance here. She looked stunned, like the thought of me rejecting her never crossed her mind. She'd really expected she could just waltz back into my life because it was convenient for her. And then, as if realizing she was losing, she got angry. Her whole tone shifted, and she began yelling, calling me selfish, insisting I owed her a chance to make things right. She even brought up the house, claiming it should still be hers, saying if she'd wanted, she could have divorced me back then and taken half of everything. In that moment, her real colors shone through, and I felt a strange sense of relief. I was finally seeing her for who she truly was. I didn't argue or raise my voice. I just looked at her and said, we're done. You wanted a different life, and now you have it. This isn't my responsibility anymore. With that, I closed the door in her face, cutting off whatever last words she had. As I stood there, hearing her muffled shouts from the other side, a strange calm washed over me. She could knock, yell, cry, whatever she wanted, but I knew I'd never let her back in. The woman I'd loved, the woman I'd married, she was gone. And all that was left was a stranger who thought she could step back into my life whenever it suited her. I turned away from the door and sat down, feeling lighter than I had in years. After I slammed the door, I thought that was the end of it. I figured she'd get the hint and leave. But no, she kept banging on the door, shouting all kinds of things. I could hardly believe her audacity. This was my space, the one place I'd rebuilt from the ruins she left behind, and she had the nerve to stand there demanding I listen to her. At first, I considered ignoring her, just letting her scream until she tired herself out. But then, a wave of curiosity struck me. Curious to hear what excuse she'd offer this time, I cracked the door, just enough to let her know I was listening without inviting her in. Her face showed shock, likely because I wasn't reacting how she'd hoped. She immediately launched into a speech about how she was ready to forgive me for slamming the door and wanted to start fresh, as if we were just having a minor argument and not dealing with her disappearing act. She rambled on about how we could make things work if we both made an effort. At that point, I couldn't hold back and laughed. The audacity was almost unreal. She looked furious, as if I was somehow wrong for not taking her seriously. I told her, you left. You had your chance and threw it all away. I'm not going to act like none of that happened just because it suits you now. Her face turned red as she began talking about how hard it had been for her, how she'd felt lost after leaving, and how she'd only realized her mistake too late. But I wasn't buying it. I reminded her that leaving had been her choice. She'd planned it, lied about it, and followed through. Her regret meant nothing to me now. That's when her tone completely changed. She dropped the remorseful act, accusing me of being unfair, saying I didn't even have the decency to give her another chance. She even had the nerve to say, if I'd wanted to, I could have taken everything from you back then, half of everything you own. I just stood there, amazed that the woman who'd left me without a word thought she deserved some sort of credit for not financially ruining me. I told her, so I should be grateful. Grateful that you ditched me without taking my things too. She stared at me, her face a mix of anger and something else, maybe desperation, maybe guilt, but at that point, I didn't care. All the years I'd spent feeling guilty, questioning myself, wondering if I was somehow to blame, melted away in that moment. I finally saw her for who she really was, and it felt like a huge weight had been lifted. Still, she wasn't done. She paced on my porch, ranting about how I'd never find anyone like her, that I'd regret not giving her another chance. It was bizarre she was the one who'd shattered our relationship, and now she was trying to convince me I was the one missing out. When she realized I wasn't going to budge, she got louder, claiming that I'd forced her to leave in the first place. She actually suggested that if I'd been more understanding about wanting kids, none of this would have happened. According to her logic, my inability to father a child somehow justified her running off with someone else to have one. I could barely believe she was trying to make this my fault. I cut in, saying, If you wanted a kid that badly, you could have told me the truth. You didn't have to lie to my face and pretend everything was fine. While planning your exit, she looked stunned, like I'd slapped her, but I kept going. You made that choice on your own, and now you have to live with it. That's not my problem anymore, she tried a final angle, putting on a sad expression and asking me to consider the child, saying I was being unfair to him. She even tried to use him to guilt trip me, like I was somehow the bad guy here. But I wasn't falling for it. I told her, I don't know that child. I have no connection to him. He's not mine, and neither are you. At that, I saw something shift in her expression. Maybe it was real regret, or maybe just frustration, but it didn't matter to me. She was just a stranger now, one who tried to walk all over me and expected me to welcome her back, as if nothing had happened. She stood there for a few seconds, probably hoping I'd change my mind, but I didn't say another word. I watched as she finally grasped that I was serious. Then, without looking back, I shut the door, knowing there'd be no going back. As I stepped away from the door, I felt lighter than I had in years. She'd spent all this time thinking she could waltz back into my life, but it was over. I was free, and there wasn't going to be any second chance, not for her, not for us. She was just a memory now, one I was finally putting where it belonged in the past. After years of guilt and pain, I felt like I could finally breathe again, and honestly, it felt good. The moment I closed that door, I felt an odd calm wash over me. I wasn't angry or sad, not even surprised. It was like all the energy I'd wasted on her, the guilt, the regret, the endless questions just vanished. I'd finally found the closure I didn't realize I needed and was ready to move forward. It was truly over this time. But of course, things didn't wrap up as neatly as I'd hoped. A few days later, I got a text from her mom apologizing. She said she was embarrassed by her daughter's actions and had tried to talk sense into her, but it clearly hadn't worked. Her mom had always been a good person. She'd been there for me a lot after her daughter left. I could tell she was genuinely upset about everything. I didn't blame her, but I also didn't want to get pulled back into the mess. I responded with a polite thanks for checking in and left it at that. There was no need to explain or go over the details again. She understood enough to know it was over. Over the following weeks, I picked up bits and pieces from mutual friends and social media. Apparently, she was back living with her parents, and it wasn't going smoothly. The guy she'd left me for the kid's father had completely bailed. He clearly wasn't in it for the long haul, and now she was left figuring things out on her own. She'd burned so many bridges that there weren't many people willing to help her. The few old friends we'd had, who were initially on my side when she disappeared, had no sympathy left for her and didn't want to get dragged back into her drama. Her parents weren't thrilled either. They weren't in the best financial position, so supporting her and the baby was a heavy burden. I found out about her situation a bit later when her father called me. I almost didn't pick up, but curiosity got the better of me. He was civil yet straight to the point, mentioning how they were struggling financially and subtly suggesting that I might consider helping out. He brought up how I'd once cared for his daughter, then went on about the baby and how tough things had become for them. I listened quietly, but when he began explaining that she just needed some support to get back on her feet, I couldn't help but feel a bit amused. I told him, as politely as possible, that her choices were her own, and I wasn't in the place to offer any assistance. I think he understood because he didn't push further. Soon after, her friends started reaching out. Some of these people I hadn't spoken to in years. A few attempted to guilt me, saying she was going through a rough patch and that maybe I could be compassionate enough to give her another chance. One even had the audacity to suggest that her child needed a father figure and that I shouldn't let bitterness stop me from helping him. But I held firm. I wasn't about to feel guilty for finally putting myself first after all those years of feeling like I wasn't enough. I'd given that woman everything I had, and she chose to throw it away. The least she could do now was accept her decisions instead of expecting me to step in and rescue her. Over time, the calls and messages dwindled, and eventually they stopped. It seemed everyone finally understood that I was serious, that I'd moved on and wouldn't be dragged back into her mess. And that's when I felt a true sense of peace settle in. My life felt calm, grounded in a way it hadn't in ages. I had my routine, my friends, my job. It wasn't a flashy life, but it was mine, and I'd rebuilt it on my terms. The surprising thing was, I began to find joy in simple things again, things I hadn't really appreciated while I was married. I took long walks, cooked meals for myself, read the books I'd always meant to get to. The freedom was invigorating, and I realized I didn't need anyone's approval to live as I wanted. For once, I wasn't tied to someone else's happiness or expectations. It was like I'd finally reclaimed my life, bit by bit. Occasionally, I'd bump into someone who knew us both, and they'd ask, "Hey, whatever happened with her?" I'd give a short, polite answer and steer the conversation elsewhere. It wasn't that I was hiding anything, I just didn't want to keep reopening a part of my life that was fully behind me. She was in my past, and I'd finally learned to leave her there. As for her, last I'd heard, things weren't going smoothly. She was struggling to hold down a job and still bouncing between her parents' home and various friends' places, moving on when she'd overstayed her welcome. People I barely kept in touch with would message now and then, telling me she was seeking help from anyone who would listen, hinting that she still hoped I'd come around and maybe step in as a father figure for her child. But that was never going to happen. I'd invested too much time and effort rebuilding my own life to ever consider going down that path. I wasn't going to be her fallback option just because her plans hadn't panned out. In the end, I got the closure I needed. She'd made her choices, and now she was facing the consequences. Meanwhile, I'd found a sense of freedom, a real, lasting peace that I hadn't felt since the day she left. I was done letting her shadow loom over my life. I'd moved on, and I was content not in some grand, dramatic way, but in a quiet, steady way that was more than enough.